Before he took his last breath, Paul Newman broke a silence that had lasted more than half a century. The truth he revealed about Hollywood's biggest legends shocked even those who thought they'd heard it all. Because behind the glamour and gold were secrets so dark, the world wasn't ready to hear them, until now. When Paul Newman's name is mentioned, people think of blue eyes, unmatched charm, and quiet strength. But behind that calm, legendary face was a man who had seen and heard more than anyone could imagine. In his final years, as age started to take away his energy, Newman began opening up about the world he once belonged to, a world of secrets buried deep beneath Hollywood's golden glow. Paul had been part of Hollywood's golden age. He had lived through its power, glamour, and lies. He had seen how fame was built and how truth was hidden. To the public, that era was perfect. Movie stars smiled for cameras, wore diamonds, and spoke about dreams. But what Paul knew was that those smiles often hid pain, and those dreams came at a terrible cost. In his last interviews and private talks, Paul Newman spoke not just about films or fame, but about people, famous legends who carried secrets they could never reveal. He said that old Hollywood was not a place where everyone could be themselves. It was a system built on control, image, and silence. Behind the lights, there were people forced to hide who they truly were, just to survive in the industry. Newman had watched fellow actors struggle with identity and truth. He once said that the studio system could take a person and rebuild them into something else, someone else. Men and women were given new names, new stories, even new pasts. Sometimes it went further than that. Some of Hollywood's most beloved stars were not who the public believed them to be. According to Newman, during the 1940s and 1950s, studios held total power. Contracts were strict, and image was everything. Executives could destroy a career in one night if a secret leaked. For those who were different, whether in their identity, sexuality, or gender, the risk was life-changing. Newman said he knew people who lived their entire lives pretending, trapped inside a role even when the cameras stopped rolling. He never revealed names directly in public, but those who were close to him said he hinted about certain stars whose real lives had been erased. He had a deep sadness when he spoke of them. To Paul, it was cruel that people had to hide their truth just to work. He called it Hollywood's greatest lie, that the dream factory sold beauty while hiding the pain behind it. In one quiet conversation, a close friend said Paul mentioned a few names from the old studio days, actors who had been forced to change everything about themselves, even their identities at birth. Back then, being different wasn't just a social risk, it was a professional death sentence. The industry protected its image more than its people. Paul's own honesty made him stand apart. He was known for being grounded, for refusing to play the typical Hollywood game. He didn't drink the fame potion the way others did. Maybe that's why, toward the end of his life, he felt it was his duty to speak about what really happened behind the curtains. He said the pressure on certain stars was unbearable. Some had to go through surgeries, some lived double lives, and some were constantly haunted by fear. Their studios controlled everything: who they dated, what they wore, how they talked, and even what gender story the public was told about them. Newman was never one to gossip. He didn't tell these stories to create scandal, he told them because he was heartbroken by how those people suffered. He saw how talented, genuine souls were reshaped by the Hollywood machine. It wasn't just about beauty or image, it was about survival. Paul spoke about one actress, famous in the 1950s, who had captivated the world with her beauty. But behind the camera, she lived in fear. Her identity had been rewritten by her studio long before she became famous. Newman said she had told him once, in tears, that she didn't even recognize herself anymore. She said, "I'm a story they wrote, not a person." Those words stayed with Paul forever. The older he got, the more he realized how much truth had been buried in that era. He often said that fame had a dark side that few understood. The audience saw perfection, but the stars lived with secrets they could never share. And some of those secrets were about who they really were. Paul knew that Hollywood had built its legends on illusion. That illusion made people rich and powerful, but it also destroyed many souls. By the time he reached his 70s, Newman didn't care about protecting anyone's false image anymore. He wanted to speak the truth about the system that broke so many hearts. In one interview, when asked what he thought of classic Hollywood, he smiled sadly and said, "Beautiful stories, beautiful faces, but too many lies." It was one of the few times he spoke with such quiet anger. He was not talking about movies. He was talking about the people trapped behind the movies. Paul's truth-telling wasn't meant to hurt the memory of those legends. It was his way of honoring them, of acknowledging what they went through to give the world its dreams. He wanted people to see them not as perfect icons, but as human beings who suffered for their art. He knew that in those days, some stars carried secrets that would have shocked the world if revealed. As Newman grew older, his reflections became sharper. He once told a biographer, if people knew what those actors lived through, they would see Hollywood differently. He wasn't exaggerating. He meant that the golden image people adored was built on countless private tragedies. Many of those stars were forced to live in silence, pretending to be someone they weren't, just to stay alive in the system. And so, as his health began to fade, Paul Newman started to open up more. Not in headlines, but in quiet words to trusted friends and interviewers who respected him. He wanted the truth to be known someday, that behind the beauty and charm of the golden age were real people who lost their right to live as themselves. To Paul, that was the biggest tragedy of all. The camera adored them, but the world never knew who they truly were. When Paul Newman passed away, many thought they already knew the man. To the world, he was the definition of integrity, an actor who balanced fame with grace, a man who stayed loyal to his wife, Joanne Woodward, and used his success to do good. But even those closest to him knew there was something heavy on his mind during his final years. Something that didn't fit neatly into interviews or awards. It was the truth about the world that made him famous, the truth about Hollywood's golden age, and the people who paid the highest price to build its illusion. In quiet conversations with friends, Newman often spoke with sadness about how many of his peers had lived their lives pretending. He wasn't talking about acting. He meant something far deeper, people who had been forced to become someone else entirely, just to survive in an industry that demanded perfection and punished difference. Paul had seen it firsthand. He entered the business in the 1950s, right as the old studio system was beginning to crumble. He heard the whispers, saw the scars, and met people who had spent decades hiding behind identities created for them by publicists and producers. The public saw beauty, glamour, and elegance. Newman saw fear. He saw actors terrified that a single rumor could destroy everything. He once told a journalist friend that the golden age was a kingdom of masks. Everyone had one. Some wore them proudly, others wore them because they had no choice. Behind those masks, he said, were real people, people who had been reshaped by a machine that only valued what sold tickets. Paul's reflections weren't made to create scandal. He was too dignified for gossip. What pained him was how cruel the system had been. He described the studio era as a time when executives played God, deciding who deserved to exist in public. If an actor's real life didn't match the image, it was erased. And for some, that meant erasing their entire identity, from birth records to personal histories. He once mentioned that during his early days in Hollywood, he learned not to ask questions about anyone's past. It wasn't polite, and it wasn't safe. Many people in that world had stories they couldn't tell. There were actors whose real names, backgrounds, and even genders had been rewritten to fit what the studios needed. It was all part of Hollywood's grand illusion. Paul Newman didn't name names publicly, but people who knew him said he carried deep empathy for those who lived under that shadow. He remembered one particular actress who had become one of the biggest stars of the 1950s. To the public, she was a symbol of grace and beauty. But in private, Newman said she carried immense pain. Her studio had rebuilt her life from the ground up. She once told him that she couldn't even remember the sound of her real name anymore. "I was born twice," she told him quietly, "but only one of those lives is allowed to exist." Paul was haunted by her story. He said that Hollywood didn't just make stars, it erased people. It taught them to perform even when the cameras weren't rolling. It was a place where truth was the one thing nobody wanted to buy. He saw it again and again. Actors forced into marriages they didn't want, forbidden to love who they truly loved, and told to change everything about themselves. Studios controlled every detail, their diet, their speech, their wardrobe, even their bodies. And for a select few, that control reached far beyond the public eye. It reached into their very identities. In one of his final reflections, Paul spoke about how cruel it was that so many people had to live in fear of exposure. The idea that someone could lose their entire career just because of who they were never left his mind. "We sold dreams," he said once, "but at a cost no one ever talks about." What he meant was that the golden age, as beautiful as it looked, was built on secrets. Behind the smiles and silk gowns were lives that had been rewritten to fit the fantasy. It was a world obsessed with appearances, where truth was dangerous and image was everything. Paul Newman's own honesty made him an outsider. He refused to play the usual Hollywood games. He didn't chase headlines or scandals. He stayed loyal to his wife, avoided unnecessary drama, and focused on his craft. Maybe that's why people trusted him. They knew he wasn't speaking for fame, he was speaking because his heart was heavy with truths he had carried for years. One of Newman's close friends once revealed that during a long late-night talk, Paul said something that stayed with him forever. "They were prisoners," Paul said quietly. "Beautiful, talented, brave prisoners of a golden cage." That one sentence summed up what he felt about those who had been forced to hide their real selves from the world. Paul knew that many of those people had died without ever revealing who they truly were. Their secrets went with them, buried under fame, myth, and carefully crafted lies. He hated that they never got the chance to be free. To him, they were victims of a system that cared more about ticket sales than human souls. In his last years, as his health declined, Newman began to speak more freely about the truth behind Hollywood's golden image. He didn't mean to expose anyone personally, he wanted people to understand the cruelty of the system. He wanted future generations to see past the glamour and recognize the pain it caused. He believed that the world deserved to know that many of its biggest legends were more than just their stage names. They were survivors, people who endured decades of pressure, lies, and fear. And some of them, Paul said, had to live under identities that weren't even their own, because the world back then couldn't handle the truth. He talked about one famous leading man, known for his tough image and deep voice. The public adored him as the perfect symbol of masculinity. But Paul hinted that this actor had spent his entire career pretending, forced into that image by a studio that refused to let him live as himself. Paul never revealed the name, but his sadness when speaking of him said enough. Newman said that Hollywood was full of stories like that, hidden identities, rewritten lives, and buried truths. And yet, even as he spoke about the darkness, he never stopped respecting those people. He admired their strength, their courage, their ability to keep going despite everything. Paul often said that the real legends of Hollywood weren't the ones who smiled for cameras, they were the ones who endured the silence. He believed that if people knew what those actors went through, they would love them even more, not less. He once reflected, they didn't lie because they wanted to. They lied because the world gave them no choice. That sentence captures everything he believed about the old system. It wasn't about deceit, it was about survival. Even now, years after his death, Paul Newman's words carry weight because they came from someone who had seen both sides. He had lived inside that world but never let it change who he was. He used his later years to shine a light on those who couldn't speak for themselves. When his private notes and interviews surfaced years later, many were stunned. The man who symbolized Hollywood's honesty had revealed its greatest hypocrisy. His quiet statements about hidden lives weren't just rumors, they were confessions of what he had witnessed firsthand. He called it a tragedy written in gold ink. To him, the Golden Age wasn't golden at all. It was a shimmering disguise hiding pain, loneliness, and fear. He wanted the truth to set those forgotten souls free, even if it came decades too late. Newman's words made many people uncomfortable. Old Hollywood lovers didn't want to believe their icons had lived under such cruel circumstances. But others saw it as a long overdue truth. For the first time, someone with credibility had confirmed what insiders had whispered for years, that behind the most glamorous era of cinema lay stories of heartbreak and lost identity. Paul's honesty didn't tarnish those stars, it humanized them. He believed that people deserved to know how strong those actors really were. They weren't just movie stars, they were survivors of a system that demanded perfection at any cost. To Paul, their struggle made them even more legendary. Because despite everything, they kept creating magic on screen. They gave joy to millions, even while hiding pain that could never be spoken of. As Paul's life came to an end, those around him said he seemed lighter, as though finally sharing these truths had eased his conscience. He had carried the weight of Hollywood's hidden stories for too long, and letting them out, without names or blame, was his way of honoring the people who couldn't speak for themselves. His final wish, according to a close family friend, was that people would look back at the Golden Age with both admiration and understanding. Admiration for its art, but understanding for its victims. They weren't false, he said once, they were forced. That simple statement carried the power of his entire message. In the end, Paul Newman's revelations weren't about scandal, they were about compassion. He didn't want to destroy anyone's legacy. He wanted to reveal how much courage it took for those people to live under impossible circumstances. He wanted to show that truth, no matter how painful, was always worth telling. And that's what made Paul Newman different. Even in death, he refused to let the lies win. His voice still echoes through time, a reminder that fame is never what it seems, and that behind every beautiful illusion, there are human souls struggling to be seen. Paul Newman left behind more than films, more than fame. He left a message that still matters today: truth is the only legacy that never fades.